dear distinguished colleagues, friends, guests, students. Let me express my emotion, my gratitude for the honor I have received this morning with this title of Professor Honoris Causa, and for this invitation as key speaker at this important conference. Receiving this recognition of Professor Honoris Causa from a young but already esteemed academic institution in Macedonia, it is not only a personal privilege for me, but also a tangible sign of the value of cultural, scientific, human dialogue between our countries, Italy and North Macedonia. This title strengthens my commitment to actively contribute to the promotion of knowledge, research and international academic cooperation. I would like to take this opportunity to thank all those who have made this moment possible, all my colleagues who supported my candidacy, the students who represent the future of our society, and all those who every day are committed to making the university a place of knowledge, freedom and growth, a place of peace. I hope that this recognition that I receive will lead to even closer collaboration between my university, University of Napoli Orientale, and the Goce Delcev University of Stip, in the common interest of science, education and culture. I feel very close to your community, believe me, and I truly hope to be able to contribute more and more to your journey with the promise to give my best at every opportunity. As a scholar of international law, I would like to add that it is a pleasure and an honor to be in this country. North Macedonia, which has a historical and legal significance that goes beyond its size, representing a unique case of connection between past and present and future. While it evokes the historical legacy of ancient Macedonia, mainly with Alexander the Great, it also embodies a modern example of peaceful conflict management, protection of minorities, and respect for international law. Its complex development shows how even a small state can have a significant influence on history and global law. Now I come to the topic of my intervention. Substantially, I will divide it into three parts. What was international law from its origins until World War II? What has it become with the development of cooperation, in particular thanks to the phenomenon of international organization, mainly the United Nations system? And finally, what are the symptoms and dangers of a return to 19th century relations between states? So, first part, from its origins until the Second World War, international law was essentially the law of coexistence among states. It should be recalled that war was still considered a physiological part of international relations rather than a pathological one, serving the pursuit of Lebensraum for German National Socialism, the fourth shore for Mussolini, the construction of colonial empires for UK, France, and other colonial powers. War was therefore considered entirely legitimate. It was the continuation of politics by other means, as Prussian General Karl von Clausewitz argued. As a result, international law was essentially the language of chancelleries, with no significant effect on domestic legal systems. And its production was limited mainly through bilateral treaties. Democratic regimes were absent or very, very few. There was no consideration for human rights or environmental protection, and humanity was divided into races. At the time, international law was essentially the law of some European states. The idea of regulating relations with non-European states, mainly Ottoman Empire, China, Japan, United States, was timidly emerging, mainly for commercial reasons. On the political front, it is worth noting the emergence of the so-called Monroe Doctrine and the resulting rigid separation between America and Europe, which led to a crisis into trade relations. It was not until 1856, finally, that the war of privateering was officially abolished by the Congress of Paris. Thanks mainly to British Crown, this had transformed pirates into agents of the state, or privateers, duly authorized, as we know. Let us dwell for a moment on the methods of warfare. Originally, no restrictions were envisaged. The humanization of war, which is certainly an oxymoron, but also an urgent necessity, came afterwards. The history of international humanitarian law and the birth of the International Red Cross coincided with the wars of independence in Italy. Traveling on business to the region where the fighting took place in early summer 1859, Swiss national Henri Dunant happened to witness the dramatic consequence of the Battle of Solferino, with nearly 10,000 people dead in half a day, a crucial clash in the Second Italian War of Independence. Shocked by the huge number of wounded and the lack of medical assistance, he organized the first aid to the people, reciting the motto, "We are all brothers." And he quickly secured the support of the civilian population. In the days following the battle, the necessary care was provided without distinction to Italian, French, and Austrian wounded. In 1862, Henri Dunant published the book A Memory of Solferino, in which he not only described his impression, but also posed a question that triggered a far-reaching process. Would it not be possible to establish relief societies whose aim would be to provide care for the wounded in times of war by zealous, devoted volunteers who are well qualified for such work? And so, a widespread movement of opinion throughout Europe was the consequence, which led to the signing of the Convention for the amelioration of the condition of the wounded in armies on the field, 22 August 1864. By 12 states. This led to the foundation of the International Red Cross and consequently for international humanitarian law. So the set of international legal rules governing the conduct of armed conflicts and aimed at limiting the effects of war for humanitarian reasons. Main objectives were to protect persons who do not or no longer participate in hostilities, civilians, wounded, prisoners of war, and so on, to limit the means and method of combat by prohibiting the use of weapons and tactics that cause unnecessary suffering, preventing and discriminate attacks on the basis of proportionality and military necessity, preventing indiscriminate attacks to hospitals, schools, museums, churches. So the idea was to try to humanize at least armed conflicts, seeking to protect human dignity. It is therefore prohibited to inflict unnecessary and superfluous suffering to soldiers, and it was prohibited to hinder or block the sending and delivery of food and medical aid. All this was codified at the end of the 19th century with the Hague Convention, and then in 1949 with the Geneva Conventions and 1977 additional protocols relating in particular to the protection of the civilian population and combatants. All this was transferred very soon to customary law, and so it is applicable regardless of treaties that provide for it. A phenomenon that began with the so-called Mertens Clause. This was until World War II. So starting with international humanitarian law, international law began to change at the end of the 19th century. The idea of cooperation and the transition to multilateralism gained ground. As it is well known, an attempt at institutionalization of the international society took place with the League of Nations after the First World War. But it was above all the second post-war period that gave impetus to a new way of understanding and regulating international relations. What kind of world did states try to build after 1945? The Charter of the United Nations, starting from its opening words and preamble, explains the idea behind all this, the reaction to the humiliation of human dignity that had occurred with 2 world wars in the century. Hence the Copernican revolution of considering war as a meta-legal phenomenon outside the law. The reservation of the use of force to the Security Council, albeit in the oligarchic composition we know, the transition to cooperation and multilateralism, the emergence of the right to development and the right of development, and above all the great moving enhancement and multiplication of international organizations through the transfer of sovereignty by states, something which was unthinkable few decades earlier. The United Nations first, and then the European Union, with the creation of the single market and the supranational legal system prevailing over the distinct national systems, remain the most notable examples. The fact is that there was a plan that those present at the creation of the post-1945 world order shared to a degree. A plan that was supplemented by subsequent common action that was interrupted but not destroyed by Cold War rivalry, and that constituted a sort of genetic program for that order which was largely completely following the gradual end of the Cold War. The result was the luckiest generation in history, my generation. I am talking about those born, especially in Europe, between 1945 and 1965. Let me quickly mention some of the main elements of this new international order. Two of them have been already stated by myself, that is the elaboration of rules of international humanitarian law, and the restrictions on the use of force except in individual or collective self-defense or with the authorization of the Security Council. But let's mention some others. The development of an international law of human rights, first at regional level, after on global scene, and the regime of refugee protection, 1951 Convention, now considered as general international law, notwithstanding the declarations of Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni yesterday at the General Assembly of the United Nations, where she said that this convention is something that are, may I say, belonging to the old system, but they are really something on which we hope that will be followed. Nevertheless, we really have a background that prevails a still valid general rule that the state is entitled to control access to its territory. Everyone has the right to migrate according to the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, but there is no right to enter a territory, as we know. Another point is the world regime of free trade, which was established, arduously negotiated in the WTO, covered agreements with accompanying dispute settlement mechanism, including a workable mechanism of appeal for the first time in a global agreement, in force from January 1995. A diffuse system of environmental protection, including most recently climate change. The regulation of ocean spaces in a comprehensive agreement, 1982, the UNCLOS, also with compulsory dispute settlement. The development of international criminal law, first through ad hoc tribunals, then with the International Criminal Court. A regime of nuclear non-proliferation, which has at least limited the number of declared and undeclared nuclear weapon states, while allowing access to nuclear energy technology. and the raise and consolidation of the principle of self-determination. Whatever the defects and gaps, I do not think that this program is illusory or trivial. Of course, it has been partially and imperfectly implemented, and we can all point to our favorite illustrations of silly moves at the transnational level where these values seem to have been taken to excess. Some states have been skeptical of the promises of multilateral treaties. The United States has failed to ratify numbers of the treaties it had signed, notably the Law of the Sea Convention of 1982, which is nonetheless frequently invoked by the United States themselves, for example, in relation to the South China Sea. But its lack of participation in particular multilateral treaties has not prevented the development of a substantial body of new international law over the past 70 years. International law is flexible enough to accommodate dissenters. As some states retreat, we can expect others to step forward, as witness strong statements from the European Union and China of their commitment to the Paris Agreement on climate change, which the United States withdrew from ratifying on the first day of Donald Trump's installation, as we know. Moreover, like any legal system, international law will only survive if it has the capacity to change and develop over time. Adjustments may be necessary to respond to perceived inequalities or injustices. We should also recognize that allowing the possibility of withdrawal by including express clauses in treaties may be the price of getting states to consent to be bound in the first place. Withdrawal is not always to be condemned, but we should also be wary of the increasing rhetoric of skepticism towards international law. Over time, this may precipitate a larger scale retreat into sovereignism and unilateralism. We should be ready to defend the communitarian values of international law against this possibility. But let me move on the third point of my speech, the concluding one, which I consider to be the most important, but also the most painful. What are the symptoms and the dangers of a return to 19th century relations between states? In 33 centuries of history, 31 have been characterized by war. Today, we are experiencing a third world war fought in pieces, as Pope Francis said. Small pieces of a global war. There are 56 conflicts underway, and while in the First World War 90% of the dead were soldiers, 10% of civilians. In the Second World War, 52 soldiers and 48 civilians. In today's conflicts, we are at a percentage of 75% civilian death and 25% military. But these figures do not apply to the present Israeli-Palestinian conflict in Gaza. For the first time, maybe, in history, the enemy here is the civilian population. The army of a self-defined democratic state is engaged in exterminating civilians, elderly, women, children, using every means possible, even hunger as a weapon of war. No longer we see armies deployed on the battlefield. No longer sensitive targets in cities are bombed. But what is happening is indiscriminate extermination, and international humanitarian law no longer exists. This is the most striking example of the current crisis, but there are others. In most Western countries, practically all European countries, particularly those in the European Union, there is a tendency of national institutions to defend themselves against international commitments, which are perceived with annoyance as limitations and obstacles to free government action. Countries such as Poland and Hungary, where democracy seemed to end on the election day, fortunately something has changed in Poland, started this trend, and many constitutional judges have paid the price. In Italy, too, we have unfortunately experienced attempts to weaken international law and European law, despite the fact that our constitution requires supranational law to take precedence over domestic law. There are many examples, but unfortunately there is not enough time to go into that here. The crisis facing international organizations is evident. The wealthiest countries are leaving the system or reducing their financial and personal support. Yesterday there was an attack to the United Nations by President Trump, as some of you have seen on the internet. We are returning to bilateral relations. It should be remembered that multilateralism also serves to defend weaker countries that are vulnerable to economic blackmail, which is easily exploitable in a bilateral relationship. Third, the return to the right of coexistence rather than cooperation. This also serves to the balance of power between states, as evidenced by the temptation to conquer new territories. Hence the strengthening of the concept of spheres of influence, which was at the root of the evils of the 20th century. Fourth, the economic crisis, partly a consequence of and partly induced by the above, implies the emergence of protectionism, mistrust between public and private operators worldwide, and the forcing of freely agreed rules. 5. The extreme valorization and on the other hand, the shameful demonization of private persons, of individuals. Two examples. The first, the valorization, is that of the neo-feudal lords of the third millennium, new pirates, to whom licenses are granted, who aspire to be entrusted with dominions in the public sphere, to manage parts of the common goods represented by cyberspace and outer space, almost usurping democratic sovereignties. The prototype is Mr. Elon Musk, the famous American magnate and influencer, who from his country has criticized Italian judges for being guilty of applying a ruling by the European Union Court of Justice contradicting the government's initiative concerning migration by sea. And who is planning, Mr. Musk, in addition to creating a sort of Gaza resort, to occupy Mars despite what the Outer Space Treaty states in Article 2, and I quote, "Outer space, including the moon and other celestial bodies, is not subject to appropriation by states, whether by claim of sovereignty, by means of use or occupation, or by any other means." End of quotation. The second example of demonization of an individual, is given by USA sanctions against Francesca Albanese, United Nations Special Rapporteur on the occupied Palestinian territories, an independent expert sent to Gaza by the United Nations General Assembly, who, because of her activities and reports, is not only unable to travel to the USA, but she is also rejected by the entire international banking system. She cannot have her own bank account, okay, due to USA sanctions, personal sanctions. Reading current statements by world leaders on topics relevant to international law can cause confusion, if not distress, to those for whom the regulatory agreement of 1945, completed in the post-Cold War era, have become the norm. On some occasions, international law is invoked, but in an increasingly antagonistic manner. It's good for me, but it's not good for you, international law, which often results in a dialogue of the deaf. On other occasions, it is blatantly or even openly ignored. This concerns many of the agreements that governments have sought to establish in the preceding period. Is there a pattern to this, and how should we respond? How vulnerable is the edifice of international law to such rhetoric? Any reflection on the future of international order cannot ignore an analysis that, looking at the geopolitical uncertainties that characterize our world today, recalls the succession of events, actions or inactions that led to the tragedy of World War II. History is not destined to repeat itself slavishly, but we never cease to learn from the mistakes made by men throughout history. The global economic crisis of 1929 shook the foundation of the global economy and fueled a spiral of protectionism and unilateral measures, with alliances gradually eroding. Free trade has always been an element of understanding and agreement. Many states failed to grasp the need to tackle the crisis in a cohesive manner, instead relying on 19th century visions, focusing on the domestic dimension and at the most counting on the resources of enslaved peoples overseas. That was the situation in 1929 and after. Authoritarian phenomena took hold in same countries, attracted by the myth of that despotic liberal regimes were more effective in protecting national interests. The result was an intensification of climate of conflict rather than cooperation, despite the awareness that problems had to be addressed and resolved on a larger scale. But instead of cooperation, the criterion of domination prevailed, and there were wars of conquest. This was the project of the Third Reich in Europe. Today's Russian aggression against Ukraine is of the same nature. Today we are also witnessing a return to protectionism. The President of the European Commission has recently recalled that in 2024 alone, global trade barriers tripled in value, 3 times than before. We have not to forget that, for example, economic crisis, protectionism, mistrust among world players, and the forcing of freely agreed rules dealt a final blow to the League of Nations. Trust, this is the magical word. Trust is the invisible but essential foundation of the international political and financial order. It cannot be imposed, it cannot be bought, but arises from a free consensus built up over time around predictable rules, stable institutions, and equitably distributed benefits. American hegemony in post-World War II era was based on this balance. The United States guaranteed an environment in which allies, partners, and markets could grow within an inclusive and cooperative system that was mutually beneficial. In this sense, trust is the product of an order that is perceived as fair. In such an order, trust was underpinned by the belief that the game was not a zero-sum game, but that everyone, under different conditions, could benefit from it, with the possibility of greater security, growth, and freedom. We rarely dwell on periods of peace. We dwell on periods of war, but we rarely dwell on periods of peace. It is good, however, to talk about the peace of these decades, the peace of 70 years we have lived so far, with the aim of prolonging it and ensuring that it is never interrupted, to show that peace is possible, a peace that respects the rights of individuals, communities, and peoples. Give peace a chance, as John Lennon used to sing. Today, there is a growing number of people who consider international organizations superfluous, if not harmful to their interests, of abandoning them. But whose interests? Those of citizens? Those of the peoples of the world? Over the world, this does not appear to be the case. Critics of the United Nations forget, among other things, its crucial role in the process of decolonization or in the construction of a regulatory framework to curb military escalation and promote disarmament. History teaches us that the consequences of these choices are unfortunately already written. It is time to act, remembering the lessons of history and bearing in mind that the international order is not static. It is a dynamic entity that must be able to adapt to change without compromising principles, values, and rights that peoples have won and affirmed. These are questions that primarily concern the European Union itself. Does Europe intend to be the subject of international dispute, an area in which others exercise their influence, or instead to become a subject of international politics, affirming the values of its own civilization? Can it accept being crushed between oligarchies and autocrats, with at best the prospect of being living a sort of happy vassalage? As recently recalled by the Italian President Sergio Mattarella, in the 12th and the 13th centuries, the Italy of the communes, Milano, Bologna, Firenze, Pisa, Siena, Venezia, and so on, all autonomous, evocative, but entrenched in the defense of each one's identity, found it impossible to become a critical mass, to survive autonomously, and was invaded and partitioned by European empires. Europe now appears to be at a crossroads, divided as it is between smaller states and states that have not yet understood that they too are small in the face of the new global situation. The European Union is one of the most concrete examples of regional integration and is perhaps the most advanced project and example of success, notwithstanding problems, of peace and democracy in history. It undoubtedly represents a hope for countering the return of conflicts caused by nationalism. It is a model of coexistence that, not surprisingly, has inspired emulation on other continents, in Africa, Latin America, and Asia. It is a benchmark in international affairs for dynamic and constructive multilateralism, with a proposal of values and standards that concretely abandons the specious narrative that the behavior of bad actors is more concrete and fruitful than that of so-called do-gooders. I come to the conclusion. Let us remember that peace is not a free gift of history. That statesmen and peoples must commit themselves to achieving it. That peace must be desired, must be built, must be preserved, even with the patient implementation of confidence-building measures. Just think of the veritable battery of international agreements and treaties that have reinforced it over the decades. What remains of all this? Step by step, the main protagonists first began to violate them and then to denounce them. What then becomes the price of security? The threat of the use, if not the practice, of violence? No political argument, including security arguments, can serve as justification for ignoring the fundamental rules of the legal system that the international community has established at the cost of so many sacrifices in the past. Multilateralism, negotiation, political dialogue, diplomacy, rather than unilateral action, must guide the conduct of states in maintaining international peace and security. While international law alone cannot prevent the outbreak of violence, international law must remain the compass by which states are guided in defending the rule of law. For example, our hope is that, at least in Europe, despite the communicative force coming from across the ocean, and despite the rise of sovereignists, the ancient teaching of the Baron de Montesquieu in his 1748 work, De l'Esprit des Lois, will remain steadfast. Let me quote briefly some sentences of this famous book. There are three kinds of power in every state: legislative power, executive power in matters governed by international law, and executive powers in matters governed by civil law. There is no freedom when the power to judge is not separated from the legislative and executive powers. If it were united with the legislative power, the power of the life and liberty of citizens would be arbitrary, since the judge would be the legislator. If it were united with the executive power, the judge could have the force of an oppressor. All would be lost if the same man, or the same body of leaders, or nobles, or the people exercised these three powers: that of making laws, that of executing public resolutions, and that of judging crimes or private disputes. 1748, words of Montesquieu. Let me close with a historical example which concerns this country. When Aristotle, great philosopher, returned to Athens after his time tutoring Alexander the Great here in Macedonia, he indeed faced political tensions due to his perceived connections to the Macedonian regime. Aristotle, being closely associated with the Macedonian court, became a target of suspicion. He was accused of impiety, a serious charge in Athens, the same one that had led to Socrates' execution decades earlier. Rather than stand trial, Aristotle chose to flee Athens, and he said he would not allow the Athenians to sin twice against philosophy, referring to the execution of Socrates. So he withdrew on the island of Eubea, where he died on 322 before Christ. How many more times must we sin against philosophy before we learn from the mistakes of the past? As a lawyer, I believe that the international rules developed after the immense tragedies of the last century can still save us if they are preserved and observed. Thank you.